presenting tomorrow, George?
Huh?
Are you presenting tomorrow?
Yeah, I think I am. I'm nearly done with the final touches.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that I picked on the right topic.
I was scared in case I went over, but I'm like, oh, I just want to get it over and done with. So, yeah.
I didn't like,
So, wait, were you supposed to upload it as well?
well, there's no uploading thing.
Okay,
Yeah, I was like choosing the date I wanted to do, there was no upload thing.
yeah. I uploaded mine like last minute ways, like the pin slot, but I didn't think it was like the proper way of uploading it, so just like, oh, I might.
I might just keep my presentation just in case there's a upload.
Yeah. I haven't checked since. I cut myself, I don't know where.
How are you doing with the video drawing?
I managed to get like 13, 12 done. I don't know if I want, like, I've really been struggling with it.
With the shoulders.
With the back and shoulders, yeah. Like, I've struggled so bad with it, so.
I'm not.
Especially because they released the notes, I think it was yesterday or the day before.
No.
It was on Discord, I'm like, well, I could have used it earlier.
But yeah, like, I feel like, you know, when you're like, after you're trying to find out with the blades, the direction, I'm like looking at the picture, I'm like, is that what it is?
Yeah,
Or is
yeah.
Because sometimes they're like, I see like one angle, but I'm like, oh, no, there's another thing there. Is that where it's from?
Yeah.
I just randomly feel like, alright, that's it.
Yeah, I really struggled with it, so I don't know if I want to do it anymore, like until I can get feedback, because it was just like a pain.
I wonder if they'll do that again, like another week, like after we got feedback.
I hope you do, because I didn't really like, I wasn't happy with mine, but at least like, I don't know, if you could clarify it a bit more, I guess. But yeah, I don't know, I just struggled.
You're on Wednesday now.
Yeah.
I remember, did you see the thing that said, there was some stuff you didn't explain, so watch the Thursday one?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I just wish you would, like, they released the, these notes beforehand.
Because what I did was, I was watching back in the video, and when he pulls out like an example of what he wants us to do, I just quickly took a screenshot and I just posted it on the side. So whenever I'm doing one, I have it like on the side.
I did that, but it was just so blurry. It was just like, oh,
But
yeah.
did you get the one where it's like the three examples and it's got like two colors of the blue? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I want. And I've just been doing that too, like everything. I've only done 10 days, so I've got another 10 to do.
Yeah, you know, I guess like, you know, 20 is preferred, but like, would rather like you polish it out rather than the brush and get clean.
I'm hoping to get maybe 5 more done during this lesson, or at least get 15, and then
Yeah.
I'll submit the 15, and then I'll do that other listening. I'll submit it by 4. I'll see what I get done, and then I can finish the rest of my presentation, and I can get it done.
Yeah. So many presentations, like we had 2 last semester and 1 now. Just like, oh my god.
And then there's like more quizzes. Because we've got the one for that one, and then you have another quiz for the one which talks about, you know, Celtic, like inequality.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So then you get 3 quizzes.
What's the third?
Third quiz.
Huh?
I thought there was only 2 quizzes.
I thought you said there was 2 others.
Oh no.
Well, it's already just multimedia. Because they did I think, yeah, they did last year.
You doing multimedia?
Yeah. Are you? I'm actually really keen for the game design stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I was actually talking to Shane before class, and like, I was asking him about the third year game design class. It's something that I want to do, so just like,
I know what exactly I want to do with it because like we've got the 4 options to pick from.
yeah.
Either like a character, a vehicle, two asset props, and what was the fourth one? There's a character, 2 props, a vehicle. What's the fourth?
I don't remember.
Can't remember, but yeah.
I'm definitely doing the asset one. Like, I haven't really drawn assets, so it's something I want to have a go at. So, yeah. I was thinking of like some sort of competitive puzzle game.
Oh yeah, well, because we have to fill out the thing like the sheet, like
Yeah.
understand what kind of. At least we get to like make up our own little game in that game.
I think it would definitely be easier if they gave us I don't know, an example or something we can work on.
Well, you were in the workshop, you know, they put us into groups. And
Yeah, yeah.
What
But
did
like
you?
for the actual assignment, it would be cool if we had like something we could work on.
Yeah. Well, they might show us some examples of other students who like the.
Yeah.
Because then probably next week they'll show us that. Or in the lecture, I haven't watched the lecture yet.
Oh, I haven't watched the. I was supposed to, but I totally forgot. Like, and then I went to the workshop and like, oh my god, big mistake. Like at one time, I didn't watch the lecture.
I don't get to watch the lecture because I got on the Monday workshop. We're the workshop before the lecture, so
Yeah.
we're kind of weird. So it's like they tell us a bit from the lecture before we do start, so that we have at least an idea what we're doing.
Yeah.
So it's we're kind of like the test workshop.
Did you guys like did you guys do the activity in the workshop where you came up with a game for the group?
Yeah. So
What did you guys come up with?
in our group we were given the worst one that you can get, elderly, survival for console. We nearly got the VR one.
Yeah.
And so the release of console and our game that we came up in our head. It was funny because half ideas came from me and I thought, so our idea was to have like use a POV, so you're as the elderly and you get to pick 2 characters at the start. You're either an old person in a wheelchair or you walk around in a cane. And you're in like a retirement village, but like there's like 2 main levels. First, you start off in like kind of like a hotel, resident hotel, and you're at the top, and you make your way to the bottom. And it's like zombie apocalypse, and the zombies are teenage kids, because everybody's worst nightmare is a teenage kid and technology. So ideas like and like along the way. You have to like gather stuff to help you go down, but to get items you have to solve a puzzle that's like on a phone in that. So it's like it gets harder and harder as you go along. You know how it's hard for them on phones and so. And so blah blah blah, and as soon as you get like harder, and as soon as you're done with the hotel, then you get out and it's like a retirement village. So then it becomes a more open area for you to like, that becomes like the survival kind of part. So that was our little game. And you have to try and escape the retirement village.
Yeah.
What did you guys come up with?
So we got what was it? I think it was like kids to teens, and it was a building sim, and it was for an arcade, which was so difficult. So we came up with like this competitive rival building thing in the world, where like there's like on the screen like 2 sections of the game, like the screen. So player 1, player 2, you have to like build the tower, and you can knock down the other person's tower.
You know, that reminds me of, there's a game, it sounds exactly what you're saying. It's like Tetris, but it's like
Yeah, it was.
And you build your Tetris tower and you think whoever can get the highest, but then along the way you get the power up, so you can like, you can do damage to another tower, or you can help your own tower by like, making all your joints combined, so you don't get enough benefit. It's exactly what you just
Yeah, ours one was like you can win two ways, like either knock down your opponent or like finish building. And in order to get like the materials or blocks or whatever, you have to match the symbols to the blocks. So yeah, it was so tricky, but it was actually Shane who helped us. Like, I'll give you a hint. Of like, he gave us like a little.
Well, yeah, because if your audience is kids, teens, it has to like, it has to look pleasing and easy to play.
It's gonna be like fast paced as well, because like, it's an arcade. Like you don't want to sit there for hours. So.
Usually arcade, it's like stuff you can just play.
Yeah.
Just like instantly. What platform was it on?
It was an arcade.
Oh yeah, like.
I love arcades. I get so addicted to them.
I remember one when I used to live in Lottery, whenever we, very rarely, but whenever we went to Andaluca, at this tavern, they had the table thing where you and a friend sit on both sides and you're playing, what's it name, like Space Invaders. And like, if you lose, then the screen flips over, because your friend plays. And it's just sitting there like pressing the buttons and doing the joysticks. It's just so funny, just looking at the table.
Yeah.
Fun stuff. And I think it was like last year, me and Mum were thinking, should we buy one of those? They were looking at thing like $8 should we get it? We were tempted to get it, but we're like, we should. Where are we going to put it?
I remember a funny story from the arcade with there's this little girl who was like trying over and over to get like the rings for the tickets, and she was trying like for maybe like 10 minutes, and we just gone okay, and somehow I won like over 600 tickets, and she stood there just watching all the tickets go into my car, and she's like, Mom, I said, no, come on, we gotta go to the counter, and she's like, I was just like laughing so hard, like,
The only best thing that I've ever done arcade times, the building blocks, you gotta get up, go for three, go two, then you gotta get one. It's like the minor prize, or you choose one to go and get the major prize.
oh yeah.
The block stacking?
Yeah.
I got the major prize one day, and the choices I had was like a camera, I can't remember, but I saw like, it was like a Go thing. And I was like, give me that. So I basically would put in $1 in, I made 80 bucks.
Oh hell yeah.
So I was like, it was so funny because when I got it, we just finished watching the movie at a cinema, and it was just, I was like, hey, while we wait, I'll just play it. I win. Family didn't even watch it. I'm like, oh no, I got it. They're like so excited. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm the best.
I love the plushie arcades, but the thing is like they're random, so like no one can like, even if you have skill, you won't win all the time. I get so addicted. Like I love plushies. Like I used to have this collection of like Looney Tunes plushies from the arcade. Like I got like every single one of them. No, I'm actually so keen for this game. I love it.
I'll watch the election. See what it goes. But we have to write, not only are we making the record, because when we fill out the sheet, it has to be like 200 to 400 words at least, so that's easy to get.
Yeah. I've because I've done like a game art course, I've never done design, so I'm like, oh my god, this is actually quite exciting. I think it's good to like pick up other skills, like just to get different points. Yeah.
Do you like up to date on the other two practicals?
Probably not one of them. Which one was it? It was.
Because the first one was to just do a 10-second clip of anything with a little animation for at least 2 or 3 animations, and then the second one was.
I think it's like I didn't do a storyboard for the.
Yeah, you have to do a introduction of the mood board, storyboard,
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
only done the mood board and the storyboard.
yeah.
That's
I've done the planning and the.
Which one did you go for? Like which item?
I went for the RGB, which is like
I went for the dread one.
yeah.
Four.
It's like I love cartoons and stuff.
Hey everyone, how's it going? I think we're doing Ferraris today, if I'm not mistaken. Let me know if this mic is on. Just gonna get stuff set up. I think this thing is something I was drawing last night, and I thought I'd leave it up as an example of perspective in action. But yeah, I think we're going to be sketching out little rough Ferraris today. Let me check. And we probably might do some feedback if we get around to it.
Thanks, sir. Hey, Tim.
Hey. Cool. Yeah, so we're going to do basically just some sketches of the Ferrari, but actually all the Ferrari this week. Try and position your sort of Ferrari in space. Even though, I think that often, let me grab the week 6 assignment thingy. Yeah, so you guys can check out the video that we sort of have. Again, the video is a little bit more sort of stream of consciousness, right? It's not sort of the most step-by-step video. A lot of what we are doing in this session is sort of covered in week 1, where we're positioning the Ferrari in space, and your goal is to kind of make sure that that is the angle you want to choose. As we keep saying, even though you can sort of choose whatever angle you want, one like this is the most optimal for learning perspective, right? So one that's, right, one that's, oh, come on, Photoshop, better than that. Copy image. Yeah, so something like this is going to be the most effective, and really there's no reason not to do something like this. But what I do want to do is to sort of teach you the process that I normally use for these things, which is where you can ideate sketches. And I think we had some on that other page. This is sort of the result, right? Do this. There we go. So this is the kind of result, right? You want to sketch the form and try and understand the form language so that you're understanding the proportion, the little details of the car, any of the silhouette sort of details that might be a consideration. What you typically be trying to do with any sketch phase is make sure that you arrange the model or the the object you're trying to draw in such a way that we get a nice sort of 1, 2, 3 read on the object. And that's why, again, we often recommend sort of drawing it from a particular angle because you really do need to see, each side of the object to properly be able to describe the form. So even though you can sort of say, oh, but I could draw it from any angle, the reality is that that's kind of not true, because it is infinitely easier for your viewer to understand what's going on when they have like a clear 1, 2, 3 read on each side of the object. So that's why most design stuff has that kind of, 3/4 sort of view for the most part, unless again, someone's specifically designing the profile of a car or, the silhouette of a spaceship or something, and they're using that drawing as a functional design unit, right? They're actually sort of saying, well, I just want to focus on one element of this design at a time. That can be effective, as a design tool to just focus on one. But when you're presenting a design, which is kind of what we're doing here, you really, really want to focus on having a good 1, 2, 3 read on it. But I think it's really important to understand the process here and the power of the process that I'm sort of teaching you, which is where you take a sketch, and the sketch can be of anything, and you have a sketch phase here where you're free to basically explore unlimited possibilities for how you can, position and angle the subject, and you can deal with all of the things like bad tangents, awkward angles. Everything's not always going to look the best, right, from every angle. That's just kind of the way it works. There's some angles that some things are going to be, are going to look best from, and you kind of have to find that. And I think the thumbnail is a really good way for you to sort of just make sure, okay, if I position it here, right, if we sort of look at this as an example, right, are there any weird ways that the wheels and, the engine seem to overlap, right? It could be similar if you're viewing it from the top, right? You've got kind of, again, this sort of, top view, and like, does that interact with the wheel in an awkward way? You can see in some of these, there's potentially the opportunity for the mirror, right, to interact with the wheel in a strange way. So that's the sort of thing that you're sorting out at the thumbnail stage. Now with this, it's tricky because we are then going to overlay as much correct proportion as possible. So it's possible to do a sketch, and then based on us actually drawing the real car in real proportion, things might move around a bit. But the general idea is you ideate the sketch and you find something you really like, and then we take that sketch and we sort of true it up in perspective. So you're able to actually sketch an idea and then turn that sketch into a really, really, really highly polished, finished render. So that's the idea. It's about, even though this step is probably a little bit superfluous, the key is that we want to include it here because it allows us to explore that idea of ideation, sketching, and then turning that sketch into a highly polished rendered image, using exactly the same sort of angle and everything, right? So it should be that you can have the confidence to do a little thumbnail and then render that up. Does that make sense? That's basically the key here. That's why we include this ideation phase. But again, with that said, as me and Simon are often saying, really the angle probably you do want to choose is, again, this sort of 3/4, right? We're viewing it, a little bit from the front, a little bit from the side, a little bit from the top, mostly from the top. And, you could do it from the front, you could do it from the back. I think that back and front are sort of equally viable options, but really, yeah, you do want it you don't want it from like this sort of, low down sort of, angle or anything like that, because it just makes it very tricky to draw. And, it often causes a lot of problems, right? for people who try and do that. So yeah, I would recommend against doing that basically. It's hard for people to actually see what it is. I don't know whether you have anything to add, Simon.
Yeah, I think as well, like, just remember, this is the difference between like a production drawing and doing like a League of Legends splash screen. Remember, we're just for this, we're not doing League of Legends splash screen, right? We're doing production drawing that you're going to hand off to 999 times out of 1,000. This is going to get handed off to a 3D modeler, and then the 3D modeler is going to make it. So if you have like version 4 Tim's got there, and version 5, version 5 is going to get sent back to you a lot of times to be like, can you please redraw this so I can see what is going on with the car? And then you'll have to do version number 4. And then you had to do 2. Does that sort of make sense? So they're different.
You have to do them
like,
anyway.
Yeah, we're
They'll
doing
be
like a
"Cool
magazine
drawing, bro."
illustration cover. You go with number 5. You know, if we're doing something, we've got to hand off over to a 3D modeler to draw. We do number 4, right? It's actually like it's kind of important to learn that because the clearer you are with your drawings and designs and things, the better you are to work with, right? And that's actually really quite important.
Yeah. Yeah, and even with even working with 3D, I mean, the game I'm working on at the moment has a lot of sort of 3D sort of artists on it, and I'm sort of doing the spaceship stuff. And even though I did some of the stuff in 3D, you kind of still have to do a lot of overpaint, and you still have to sort of, unless you're able to build like a full-on 100% detailed out model, you kind of have to paint over it and present the same stuff, right? So some of it's easier, but you still have to show like really clear front back views of it, like fully painted up so people can see the textures that you want to use, and when you sort of, put it in situation, it's like, often the case that, they wanted these ships that we were designing to be presented basically as illustrations for marketing purposes. So, you can kind of see them in situation, but, I sort of ended up doing, it was just one ship, but I ended up doing like 3 illustrations of the ship. And, then I think it was like, I had to do 2 interior shot designs, and then I had to do like just a clear front and back view that was like fully sort of rendered, right? So it's kind of, no matter what you do, because you could kind of see all those details, right, from all the illustrations, but still we had to just redo it as like clear, front and back, clear versions on like a plain background, just for design purposes for modelers, and also people can sort of see what it is, right? So, you always need that. And it's really good to be able to sort of just work in that way. You're really making sure that it's kind of solid and stuff like that. Because you can't hide that sort of thing in illustration. But yeah, you've always got to do that, and people always have to, deal with those things and overpaint them and render them up and make them look nice from sort of basic views. So yeah, you always need that sort of view, right? You need to be able to work in it, right? So no matter what else you might have to do for the job, you're always going to have to do this. Cool. All right. And did we have some stuff from the previous week that we need to do feedback on, Simon? That was my main question. So we still might have some sort of material stuff that we were sort of doing feedback on, but let's see. Again, like the demo here is pretty simple, and I think we also have, we must have some previous versions of it, Simon, that we could probably sort of put up, doing this sort of same thing.
Lewis asked, what's the game called that you're working on? I'm pretty sure Tim can't tell you what that is.
No, I can.
Oh, you can?
Yeah. Show you their website. Their website is crazy. I think I was showing you this. I was trying to tell people to go look at this, like on when I saw you on the weekend, Simon. Yeah,
oh, cool.
It's like a full-on crazy. They have this like crazy website. It's like the most ridiculous website, the most expensive website I've like seen. I hope they. It's like a it's like what you tell me what it is. Right, but this is all just like interactive. I don't know how they did this. it's like sort of vectorized based on 3D input and stuff. It's like it's basically like a giant space MMO with aliens and sort of ships. Yeah, there's like so many concept arts working on this thing. Yeah, but I can say I'm working on it because my name is listed on the website. So it's like, well, I don't think I can show you the ship I've done yet because I don't think it's been released. But it will be. I think it'll all be sort of public pretty soon because it's sort of like crypto based. So it's in their interest to share it, right? Because the more excited people are about the thing, the better. But yeah. You tell me what it's about.
Spaceships.
Spaceships. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, they've got some cool stuff done. We're at they got like a teaser trailer. But yeah, you can see all the ships stuff that have sort of been done. Right. So there's like lots of sort of, classic sort of, sci-fi sort of stuff done. So this is the kind of stuff that people would be doing. This is probably how a lot of this stuff is done now. Where, again, they've sort of got a model, like a concept model of it, of like this thing, and then you basically photo bash in a background and, or the background could be put in through Keyshot, I guess. I think they're using Keyshot, and then they do a whole bunch of this stuff. Yeah. So it does make this sort of thing heaps easier, right? Because you don't have to like redraw all this nonsense. But yeah, so it's basically like, it's basically like lots and lots of this sort of thing, just like crazy spaceships and like weird science fiction concepts. I don't know what's going on there. Yeah. Anyway, that's it. They've got a cool trailer that's like it's just like a full-on teaser trailer. But yeah, tons of like, and they've got a lot of cool stuff that's sort of it's sort of sci-fi, but it's very sort of it's not sort of nuts and bolts sci-fi stuff. Yeah. Anyway, that's the game. There's plenty of stuff there if anyone wants to go check it out.
Looks really cool.
Yeah, it does. They've got heaps of interesting stuff. But yeah. Anyway, so I forget what I was talking about. I was talking about Ferraris. Yeah, and why I'm working on that game, I have no idea, because I normally draw cartoony fantasy stuff, but somehow people keep being like, you need to draw spaceships. Why don't you draw one spaceship? And people can often get you to do more spaceships. I think we use that one. Yeah, so the idea here is we bring up our reference. Yeah, but I mean, let me find that reference. And yeah, I mean, I do find that 3D stuff it's really not for me. I really just find it sort of, it's kind of really good when it's sort of good, but then, stuff's slow and you kind of have to wait a while for things to kind of, it's not, I feel like when computers are like 10 times as fast, it will be a lot better, but it's still a lot of kind of waiting around. And it's a different idea to just kind of drawing. So yeah, I feel like it's really good for just blocking stuff in, right? Like, I mean, if you build a model that was just like, it's a block, right? For like the length of the Ferrari, and then you built one for like wheels, I think what you guys will find is if you just build like an accurately proportioned boxy version of it, right? That'll give you so much value. That'll save you so much time. So if you think about the time to do that, I don't know how long that would take you, Simon, but like, let's say 5 minutes at a lazy gallop, you know what I mean? To basically like, you know, make a super simple box in a 3D program, right? You know, like position it in the angle you want, you know, and like render out, you know, some sort of shots and stuff like that. It's probably going to take you 5 minutes, you know, whereas, you know, us doing that here, you know, accurately, if we want that sort of proportion, you know, that's going to take us 3 hours, 4 hours, you know, even if you're pretty experienced. So that's like heaps good value. Yeah, the stuff like where you're really sort of going for the polish and stuff like that, I found it's not really for me. We'll do it, but I don't. It's not as fun as just drawing it. So yeah, the idea is we want to sort of look at that reference, which I've got up there, which you guys have sort of seen. And what I'm going to try and do is just kind of see if I can sort of sketch that car, right? So whatever sort of sketching style you would normally use, right? This is what I want you guys to sort of think about is you need to develop sort of your sketching style. And the key thing is the style that you use for sketching, right, doesn't have to have anything to do with the style that you use for sort of rendering. Now, the more sort of accurate you are, you know, with things like ellipses and, you know, sort of sketching these things, right, the better everything will be, because your little rough drawing will be more accurate and you won't have to sort of change it around. But all we're doing here is you're just sort of trying to remember and formalize those proportions, right? So I'm looking and I'm sort of saying like, okay, where is that little cockpit thing, right? Where is, like, how far does this sort of nose come out, right, beyond those wheels? Those are the things I'm looking at. So we can think about sort of simple grids, right? But mostly what I'm doing is just trying to sort of place everything. And probably the first few I do aren't going to turn out that well, right? First few are, yeah, just going to be a bit messy, right? The proportion's going to be off. That's fine. You have to trust the process with this, I think, because, you know, this does take a while to fully get there. You can see here, I think, actually these wheels need to go back a bit, all right? So you just keep doing this. And again, this is almost, I would say, Simon, like this sort of step is something that precedes really, you know, even you trying to properly position it, right? It's just trying to sort of understand proportion and the form language, right? And it gives you an idea for all the things you're going to need to look at, right? You will really study that reference a little bit better, because you're, you know, going to have to go back to it and say, man, where is this thing? You know, what is happening here? What shape is this? You know, like what shape is this thing here? And, you know, it sort of forces you to really think about that proportion. And again, what we end up doing is, you know, is sort of starting to do the preparatory steps that we would sort of, you know, normally do when we're actually sort of drawing it. Right? So ideally, this sort of forces you to, you know, really get stuck in there and look at that proportion, right? So even if I'm sketching, right, it can just help me to find the center and then sort of be like, oh, okay, so here's, right here, I'm going to have some wheels, right? So we can put in a few lines there, right? I feel like that's going to be the axle line there. And that axle line, again, is further back than I thought. Again, I've got like a rough center, right? I can sort of even think about where the sort of ground is in relation to that. and yeah, just sort of rough it in. So we're doing the same sort of thing, but you know, we normally do when we're sketching this stuff out, you know, in a more detailed way. But yeah, it's just sketchy, just super sketchy. Don't know whether that's the best ellipse there.
Yeah, just remember, guys,
So
all the references up on Flow, and then also if you scroll down to week 11, we've got like a good orthographic view as well. So yeah, just remember all that stuff's up there, guys, that Tim's looking at to do this.
Yeah. Again, I think these are sort of smaller. All right, so maybe on the next one, I'll kind of play around with that. Feels like, again, that sort of cockpit is sort of there. So I feel like, I'm just making these sort of too big. I think I've got that sort of backrest thing. All right, again, got some side mirrors. But yeah, I think this is like, needs to go back. So it's got this sort of chunky engine in there, right? V12 engine. Exhaust manifold stuff coming off the back in some fashion. Again, that's one of the more complicated things we sort of get to with this, is drawing out the exhaust. And yeah, it really feels like, again, if you look at the reference, and this is where, you know, just understanding the reference becomes really helpful, right? So if you sort of look at all these things, you can see that, you know, obviously the axle is behind the engine, you know, because you've got an engine, and then the sort of drive shaft obviously sort of comes out the back of the engine, and it's going to hit that sort of, you know, rear differential or whatever, and turn that sort of, you know, what would it be, that sort of motion that's going around from the engine that turns it into, you know, the opposite sort of motion that's actually going to spin the wheels. And you've got sort of brakes and other things like sort of in there, and that all has to be sort of back from the engine. So again, it's sort of, these things can be really tricky to manage, because you're sort of dealing with your sort of different understanding of like, where does it look like, you know, what because we sort of view the car as being like, oh, it's the red shiny bit, you know. And when you sort of imagine like, what is the length of the red shiny bit, right? We often might sort of ignore some of this stuff at the back, right? And it's very easy to do that. So think about, again, we've got wheels, the little cockpit sort of seating area is like back from that. Behind that is, again, the engine. Behind the engine is going to be a differential or something, and then coming out of that is going to be, that's where those wheels are going to be. Let's draw some sort of lines here, right, to sort of let us, again, roughly position those wheels. We can think about those wheels in general. It's just being one big sort of toilet roll thing. Right, so again, I think these wheels are like way too big. Keep making them way too big. But again, it's something more like that. So again, we just like, the idea is we just keep going, keep iterating, keep trying to understand the proportion, keep trying to understand the form, keep playing around with it, keep understanding, right? That's it. And once you sort of have that sort of form down and you kind of have a pretty good idea of what's sort of, you know, what's there, you know, then you can start to sort of position it. And when we do position it, again, you know, you don't have to, you know, start by, you know, doing it in the same sort of detail, right? You can sort of just start, right? Start that stuff in a much more sketchy way. All right, so I'm sort of, again, thinking about, right, a box that this might sort of fit into if this was not a very good box. So I'm just sketching out and trying to feel the space and what might be sort of happening to that sort of car. Again, this is not sort of technical. I'm just sort of sketching around and trying to find those sort of shapes and match basically my imagination, right, to what's happening with the drawing. And this again is important. You're like where you start when you're sort of sketching, right? Like what you start with, I think often is sort of based on so many things, but you know, it's based on how your brain thinks, right? You start with the overall thing. You know, a lot of those industrial designer people start with those kind of, you know, the two sort of wheels to define the axles, right? And they kind of almost sort of draw those wheels in first, right? And then they kind of, you know, sort of put the car on top of the wheels. So, you know, a lot of it is like, you know, how does your brain think about the design? What is the most sort of functional thing to kind of put in there first, right? And also, you know, what are you trying to figure out about the specific angle, right? Like what's sort of important about that sort of specific angle that you're sort of creating right now. So that's where, again, right? There's no sort of right or wrong way to start it, right? That's the key. Don't think like, oh, am I doing it right or am I doing it wrong? Don't worry with the sketch phase, because this is about you sort of exploring these things. And again, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do it initially, but you do have to at some point get a good understanding of what's happening with all of this sort of perspective, right? But yeah, at this stage, don't feel like, you know, oh, you know, am I getting it? Am I doing it right or wrong? Really just think about, you know, how can I sort of rough out that angle, right? Again, you know, you might sort of say, well, you know, let's think about starting with a box, because that's kind of useful, right? And again, maybe all right, maybe we've got, again, a wheel here. But yeah, let's play around with maybe drawing it from the back. Find center. Get some big wheels here. There's stuff here. I think my reference is underneath this, so it's hard for me to check it at the moment. But yeah, so we're gonna have engine stuff there, the actual engine kind of there. So you can just kind of mass it out, right? Like just be like, and I got this thing here, right? Sort of copy it there. That's sort of going down, right? And then coming out sort of somewhere here. Again, I've got these wheels. Let's try and make them a bit smaller. Now, again, tricky to place wheels on the far side when you're sort of sketching, right? That's one of those things that can be sort of tricky to get right. So again, can just be good to kind of just imagine the extremities. Right, again, think about that sort of toilet roll that kind of connects them. So yeah, and you can see I'm being pretty sort of sketchy with it. I'm not really trying to, you know, do industrial design drawings or something. I don't really know what's happening sort of up here, but this is helping me to place the car, figure out, you know, where those things are likely to be. And that's really all you're doing with the sketch phase, is you're trying to place things, get that proportion right, set yourself up for the next, right, for the next phase. So again, probably would be good to, I feel like that ellipse needs to be more open. But yeah, just keep playing around with it. Think about what your sort of final is gonna be like. Often you really find how it is so important to put in the ground plane. That will really help to make sure that a lot of stuff is contextualized. The ground plane is often like one of your best design tools, right? It's one of the absolute best things you can sort of do to explain and describe, right, what's going on. But yeah, that's basically the idea with that sort of first step, is just play around, get used to the car, look at the reference a lot. If nothing else, this is just a reason for you to sit there and look at the reference for a whole bunch of time, and you know, try and position it and move it around, and you know, do all that kind of stuff. Quick question, I think William's asking, is it fully sketches without grid the whole process to final? No. So if we look at the sketching sort of, and again, the process that I would sort of advocate, right, is we have a sketch, and what we want to do is have the best sketch you can create that is from the angle you think is going to be the best, right? Which basically is sort of a front 3/4 view or a back 3/4 view. And again, a little bit sort of an aerial shot from above is good. The trick is, and the whole process is, how do we take that sketch without a grid, and how do we create a highly polished illustration from it? Now, to create a highly polished illustration, you need a grid. So the question is, how do you take this and sort of move it to the next phase? So if we look at this sort of general process I use, if I can bring that up, you can kind of check out I just need to mute the sound. So the general sort of thing that you're going to use, let me just do. What is that? Let's find it again. Yeah. So the general process you're going to find. Go to is that we take that little sketch. Okay. And we do have other things. I think, as Simon was sort of saying, there are videos for doing the simple version of the Ferrari, which again is sort of something that we do without a grid. All right, let me mute that. Cool. Okay. So yeah, if we full screen that. So this is the general sort of process we use. Let's get better sort of resolution, right? So this is the same sort of process that I use here. It's just that we don't do as many sketches, right? So the basic idea is we sort of start with some kind of little sketch, right? And we're sort of sketching and you sort of play around with it, right? And then once you sort of have the sketch, you can then find a grid from that sketch. And once we do that, we're then going to, create sort of more grid lines based on that. And then eventually we have like a more detailed grid, right? Which again, and so the video doesn't have a lot of that sort of ideation in it, which is why I'm sort of going over it now. But the idea is that you sort of take a sketch like this, right? And then you can kind of derive from that a grid that sort of works. And I think we have been, Simon, sort of talking to people about making sure this is one of those true cube grids. So we'll probably do that as well. We'll sort of show you guys that step by step, right? The demo sort of gives you a rough idea of sort of the process, and it sort of goes through it. But yeah, what we need to do is, we sort of embellish that a little bit. Because it probably doesn't cover everything in detail, but we're going to be doing a full grid, right? I don't know, William, whether this looks like a full grid to you, but this is basically what we end up doing, right? It's sort of complete sort of line chaos, and it's all got to be done sort of properly. But I think that the question is, how does this actually fit into your process? And I think that's often one of the questions that people have in general, right? Is how do I use perspective, right? So you can understand the perspective stuff we've taught you, but the question is how do you actually use it in your process? How do you use it creatively? And so again, we can sort of say the more sketching you do, right, and the better you sort of get at perspective, then the better your perspective sketching will be. But that's kind of a little bit more amorphous. The trick here is to be able to take a sketch, right, or take any drawing and then be able to apply perspective to it, if that makes sense. So just sort of take anything, right, to sort of take a sketch and then say, oh, okay, I'm going to true that up, right? That's the word I sort of use, or the phrase I sort of use. You're going to true it up. So it's not true. It's kind of just a sketch and it's sort of messy. But there are plenty of ways to sort of take that sketchy drawing and then turn it into something that's very, very solid. And that way, again, you get the benefit of being able to ideate and sketch in whatever process you want, in whatever program you want, in whatever, on a napkin, you know what I mean, in a physical sketchbook. And as long as you like that idea and you like that angle, you should be able to then sort of translate that into a completely perspective, perfect, highly polished Sid Mead style rendering, right? That's the idea. You don't have to start in this kind of creative void of I've got my perspective grid, it's time to start designing, right? That's not typically how it sort of works. I think in many cases, if people who do industrial design probably would just redraw it. They'd kind of do a bunch of sketches and ideate the idea, and then they'd kind of be like, okay, now I know what I'm going to do, and they might sort of start doing it more sort of realistically. But yeah, so we go through the whole process and we render it out in a very sort of kind of very anal retentive manner. But we're starting sketching. Which again is sort of tricky because it doesn't, this sort of side of it doesn't really help you that much, because as I said, you kind of know what you're drawing. It's just about picking the angle. But this idea of, again, sort of taking sort of sketches and being able to sort of translate them to sort of finished things is I think really important. I'll see if I can find some other sort of good examples of that.
Yeah, I think doing some sketches like this is pretty cool because quite a lot of the time you do have a preconceived notion of what you want to do. We all have this, right? You're like, oh, I need to draw this thing. And let's say you're doing something for a character design class. Most of the time, you just draw the first thing that you think of, right? And that you want to do. And you're just it's this. But a lot of times, sometimes you want to explore the different options that you could do. So remember, this sketching process is what you would do before doing the perspective drawing. However, we've done some weird stuff where you've already done a bit of this, you've already kind of blocked out a mock little Ferrari and things, right? Which is probably at a pretty good angle already. But just remember, just separate those two facts. Just have fun sketching something at different angles and trying to use the things you're learning about perspective to just draw it at different angles and things. But don't think that has to be, you're doing that specifically so you can do the Ferrari final drawing at a funky angle. Does that make sense? They're kind of a little bit separate, but we just want to get you guys kind of sketching around and learning how to do that stuff as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a tricky one to sort of explain, but also I think the main thing that I think is going to happen here, Simon, is you're going to get a better understanding of how to actually draw the car. And one of the reasons why we got you guys to do some of this sort of simple Ferrari stuff in the first week is, again, often if we don't do so much prep stuff, half the class and this is why it's tricky, because again, for some people it's like, why are we doing this? It's like, well, because half the people normally don't start until week 4 because they fuck around trying to draw the actual car, right? They're like, oh, cool, yeah, whatever, bro, yeah, learn the formula, goes, yeah, shut up, okay, blah, blah, blah. Right, yeah, I'll do it. Oh, I didn't get it done in week 1. Oh, okay, yeah, that's whatever, but this will be easy. And then they realize they don't know how to draw the car. Do you know what I mean? And then they panic, and in week 2, they start actually drawing it in perspective, and they don't know how to draw the car, so they draw it wrong in perspective, right? They're drawing a different car. So it's like, it's got things that typically sort of happen are, and this is not, I'm not trying to sort of, sort of lump on people, you know what I mean, for doing this, but this is honestly, this is the kind of, it's an easy path to fall down, right? If you don't understand the proportion, right? Most of the problems that people have, right, is they kind of end up drawing a car that's like this. I'm not joking.
We've seen this many times.
And for the people, but for the
many,
people,
many
and for the
times.
people who do this, I'm like, it's fine, it's okay, but this is why we do this step, right? Is because a lot of people are like, oh yeah, whatever, yeah, I understand. Look, it's how hard is it, right? And then they kind of do it, and then they come and they're like, what happened? They're like, what did I do wrong? And it's like, right, yeah, you didn't do the first step, which is like figure out how the car actually looks, like figure out the proportion in your mind, so that when you're sketching it and when you're sort of drawing it, you understand like how wide are the wheels, right? So we've had ones that are literally like that, and again, it's nothing. I'm not saying that's sort of bad, right? But we also have ones that might not be quite as sort of extreme as that, right? It's very easy to make this sort of error, right? Where you kind of just like, again, I think even my wheels are like pretty sort of chunky, right? When I sort of do it, as I keep saying, I'm like, oh yeah, I keep making like the front wheels too big. Okay, let's make them sort of smaller. Let's make these sort of bigger, right? There's a lot of little proportional things there that you kind of have to learn. Otherwise, if you just kind of start saying like, okay, I run out of time, I've kind of played too much. I don't know what do people play these days? What's everyone playing? What are people playing in video game land? I'm so out of touch.
I think there's so much different stuff.
And then they
now.
kind of are like
different stuff.
What's that?
There's so much different stuff now. Everyone's all playing different things.
I guess that's true. It's not like everyone plays the same AAA game now, or same like multiplayer game.
Or Quake.
But if you kind of or Quake, I'm old enough now to know no one knows what Quake is.
Me and Tim, that's what we just played Quake. Everyone just played Quake. That's what we did.
Yeah.
It's the only game. Was that? Yeah, Duncan's like, that's his dad. How old are we, Tim?
Yeah, that's right.
We're like everybody's dad.
Yeah, that's right. But if you just start with the grid, you're going to kind of be in this different land, which is not like I'm drawing a Ferrari. You're going to start being like, okay, I got to draw a box. You know what I mean? Because that's sort of the step we show you when we're doing that is like, okay, we draw a box and it's yay long versus yay wide, right? And the problem is then you're kind of not really thinking about proportion. You're just kind of being controlled by these boxes you put down. And it's very easy to you make a tiny little mistake, or you just, again, you don't do the true cube and your box is like, a lot longer or a lot shorter or a lot square. Like, do you know what I mean? It's very easy to make these things. So this phase, I think, is really, really important, because it's just basically you looking at the reference, trying to replicate it with sort of rough drawings, and then using that as a way to, again, sort of select the sort of angle you choose. And if you do a really nice proportion sort of sketch, it's very easy to translate that into, you know, your sort of like finished rendered thing as we sort of go through, you know, that process, because you've already got the rough proportion, right? So as you true it up, you're kind of like, well, I know these things should kind of be here. Whereas when you're in that perspective land, right, when you're sort of here, where are we? Right, when you're sort of looking at this sort of thing, it's very hard to tell, like, is this going to look good? You know, it's very hard to even tell, like, when you're doing this, like, how big are those wheels going to look, you know? And that's really the tricky thing, I feel. So that's why this is here. So please don't skip it, right? Not for our sake, for your sake, because it really does just sort of make things very sort of tricky. But yeah, and the problem is if people sort of try this and they get to, you know, week 2 or 3 and they're kind of at this stage, it means you're very behind at that point. Does that make sense? So it's really important to, again, like step through this sort of properly and really think about each stage that we've got here. Because yeah, that it does solve a lot of problems going forward. And again, the reason we've got you guys to do this, a little bit of this stuff in week 1, is because again, that sort of foreshadows this, and it means just less people are likely to, you know, sort of trip up and end up at week 3 and needing to restart, right? Which is very sort of common, right? Even if you get to week 2 and you need to restart, right? Like that's a big sort of scheduling problem. So, which is not, lots of people do keep restarting, because once you've done it, it's a lot easier to redo it, but still, yeah, good to avoid that. Anyway, so that's probably, I mean, I think that hopefully explains what we've sort of got to do, you know, at sort of this stage. I might think about, again, explaining the process steps that follow in a little bit more detail, Simon, so that we can sort of, again, foreshadow those problems that people are sort of having now, where they're like, why am I doing this? What's going on? So that might be worth sort of talking about, but we should probably have a break now. I think it's going for
I think it's good. I think that every year we do this, we just narrow it down a bit more, and I think everyone in this class is really on the same page. You know, I think all of you guys really did quite a good job on your like little simple Ferrari thing. So just keep going with that. You know, we've been over ellipses like 10 bazillion times, right? So no, please no one stuff up your ellipses. All right. But we've done it. Just remember, minor axis, major axis, you know, all those little things. Yep. And then the rest of it is just the technicalities.
No, you go.
Well, the rest of it is just the technicalities of it all. Like, you know, remember, like, because we were doing this with the first years yesterday, the boat. So remember the boat. So when you're doing the chassis of the car, like the body of the car, you know, it goes from thin to thick, from curved to flat. You know, think about the shape in profile of what that is, and just plot your curves out. Do your little dots, you know, in perspective. Just plot all that stuff out. Just think your way through it all. All of this is actually really easy in isolation. It's just hard when there's all these bits that you're dealing with. But just think your way through it. Do it if you find that it gets line soup, you know, different. I mean, we're not up to this yet because you're just doing sketches, but you know, do a different color. Do the chassis, you know, orange. Do the wheels green. You know, do the seat area blue, right? And then just isolate that in your brain and just think about, what bit am I working on? This has got to be easy. How do I simplify this so it like works, right? And just think your way through those things, because a lot of times when you make a mistake, it's just like it's just a silly mistake that you do. You know what I mean? You were thinking about other stuff and you didn't do it correctly. You know, I say all the time, like Tim and I are always drawing lines in demos that go to the measuring point or the wrong vanishing point or whatever by mistake, right? Like you're just gonna make mistakes, but you just gotta, like, the quicker you catch those things, you know, the easier the whole process will be. And like, this is not. Don't let any of this sort of get overwhelming. We're trying to like chunk it down into easy, simple steps that you can do. And if you just follow those along, like you'll be fine. All right. So, but remember this week, just start with your sketches. Just like Tim said, it's just building up that visual library. Remember, the two things are not connected. Just because you're doing sketches of stuff from different angles doesn't mean you have to do the final Ferrari from different angles. Does that make sense? Everybody really clear with that? because I feel that really does throw people sometimes. They're like, oh yeah, do these ones, and then I'm
Yeah.
gonna like make my sketch from like some crazy angle, and we're just, you know, and then you do like a whole week of wasted work, because then me and Tim are like, don't do that. Just because, once again,
Yeah.
you give it too much distortion, and as soon as the more distortion you give, the harder it is to measure, right? That's why. And remember, this task is not necessarily about drawing the Ferrari. It's about learning how to measure and draw something complicated, right? So it's not, don't worry about if you're like, oh, I don't like drawing cars. Remember, just it's not about the car. It's just about drawing. Full stop.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but for this week, yeah, just do the sketching and stuff, and yeah, have a play around with those things.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Sounds good. Yeah, when we come back, I'll let go over some of the stuff we've sort of done previously to sort of show you guys how the next phase will go, where we basically take a little sort of sketch and sort of figure out how perspective works. Again, if you're actually doing this, there's probably a whole bunch of easier ways to do it, right? But we're doing this the hard way so we can learn perspective. That's really what this is about. So really, truly don't think this is about a Ferrari. It has nothing to do with a Ferrari. It's just, we're doing this in this kind of agonizing, like long way. And it's designed to, again, teach you as much about sort of measuring and proportion, because it puts you in a tight spot, right? It sort of says, like, firstly, we have to draw something to proportion that exists, which is not often what we're doing as designers. Often we're sort of just creating something that looks cool. And it's very rare that, you kind of have to get it exactly right. But, if you think about the old school way it was done, where you would do sketches and then you would have to kind of create, a sort of a finished version of something from those sketches, you do always have to get proportion, right? And be able to control proportion. So that really is a fundamental skill. But often, when you are designing things, you can kind of move it around as you design it. Right? Whereas in this case, we kind of forced to this old school way where, like, we have to match something that already exists. But that's a really good way to get control. And the other thing is, again, I'm sort of doing this thing where we sort of have to use it over a sketch, and that's kind of a very roundabout way of doing it. But that teaches us a lot about how proportion works and how your sketches work and how true are your sketches. And if you did want to true up a sketch, how you do that. So again, it's a series of exercises that are designed to help you with perspective, right? But this is often what we're doing. It's just that we're sort of doing it a little bit rougher, and you're able to kind of eyeball it, right? So if you look at that sort of drawing, that sort of thing that I was doing as an example. Where is it? Oh yeah, here we go. That one or the other one? Yeah, so if I'm sort of doing this, I mean, this was based on this little thumbnail, and it's sort of based on this sort of car that I drew before. So I'm kind of doing exactly the same thing that I'm sort of talking about, but obviously I'm not getting out a grid and I'm not figuring out sort of true cube, but I am kind of trying to be like, can I redraw this thing? Because I'm like, oh, that was cool. I need to redraw it for this other thing, right? And then, but again, the way I always do it is I always start with a thumbnail, like a little sort of illustration sketch, and, play around with that, right? I sort of start that way, right? That's sort of how I do everything. And then I kind of, just take that and, sort of draw over it. And I had to move things around and fuss around a bit. And I'm not, you can see I've got, right, there is sort of a grid there, but it's not like, and I did some guides for the wheels, but, it's not a super accurate grid or anything. It's just enough. And that's really what doing this, like this stuff will let you do, is you kind of are just really troubleshooting all these things and thinking through it. And it means, you can kind of, sketch around a little bit more and sort of wing it a bit more effectively. But I don't really think there's any way to be able to do this sort of quickly, you know what I mean, without fussing around too much, without just going through all this kind of, all this kind of nonsense and really sort of figuring it out, right? Because otherwise what happens is when you're doing this is you just kind of end up redrawing it too much, right? So the real key, if you're ever trying to do sort of technical drawing stuff, is kind of, if you start like kind of going over and over lines, it's kind of gone. Like you never really get it to look right. And you'll never be able to, they'll never look kind of clean, sketchy lines, right? It's all about sort of saying like, where are these lines? Where do these lines go? You know what I mean? Like, and just trying to do, again, those sort of cleaner, sort of smoother lines, like figuring out actually where stuff is. So, the way I would do this, 15 years ago is I just kind of hack away and grind away at it and redraw. And I might get there in the end, but really, it would never have that kind of level of polish that I sort of want.
And we're really good. We're really good at like lying to ourselves that way will be easier. You know what I mean? Like it's even sometimes I've seen like, so for example, sometimes I've seen Tim do like demos where he's like sketching things out. I can't remember what it is, right? But whatever. And he's like, oh, we'll just like put this, kind of cube in here and do the wheels or whatever the case may be. And Tim's like just wing it, like making it pretty close. And in my head, I'm just sitting there like, why don't you just do the true cube grid? Because it'll take 5 minutes and it'd be done. But Tim spends 25 minutes like fussing around with it, and like it gets there in the end. But I'm like, you could just do it from the start and not have to worry about any of this, right? So like we're just like we're just really good at going like, oh, the slow, the sort of silly crap way will be faster and better. But like it's like hardly ever
my beer
way. Yeah, and.
Hold my beer. I'm going to draw this thing without a grid.
I think that what's really cool is like, because I remember like Darren Quatch told me this as well, who's like, I think one of the best drawers of perspective is, he said to me, so like I was doing spaceships and he was like, I was doing them in the grid like this and I was drawing them and they all look like pretty stiff. And he was like, no, draw them like Tim's doing now in this sketch. Like draw them, just don't worry about the grid, just draw them, right? Just draw what you want to do. Then once you get it like 80% of the way, then put the grid on it and then like tighten everything up, because then you can leave some bits loose and you can leave some bits, that you might not have to figure out everything. And that's what we're kind of doing here, which is like doing the sketch, then putting it on the grid and then figuring it out, right? Because that's how you do it in real life. Yep. For this Ferrari, this is a very like rigid process of how we're doing it. But like if you were doing something that's, more like, for working, you're trying to like design something that's not like you don't have reference for. Does that make sense? Because the Ferrari you got reference for. It's just like we're just drawing the thing.
This is a perfect example of that sort of process, right? Because it's like, this thing is literally just sort of, I'm just drawing it, I'm sketching it out, and I'm trying to sort of feel those things. And there's a little bit of a grid, right? But it's sort of pretty loose.
Yeah, and you can see there's a thought of the perspective in there, which is great. So you want to you want to always have that thought of it, but it doesn't have to be like super rigid. And then Tim's taking that into where he's got a bit more of a solid grid and working it out.
Yeah. So it's just that, and I've basically just traced it, right? So I'm like, oh, I've got the rough idea now. Let's just add actual perspective, right? And really it's just a matter of like, all I did was put in a few lines that probably don't actually go to vanishing points on the same horizon or anything, but again, it's enough, anyway, so that's that. Hopefully that explains it. But again, it is a bit of like, this is how you should do it. It's not always how I do it, but this is how I learned to do it, and I don't think there's any other way to learn to do it, right? Like I was sort of saying, the other day about how, there's so many YouTube videos these days, Simon, that are sort of like, here's like the fastest way to improve, I don't know whether you've ever like Googled how to draw videos or something like that, but it's kind of like hilarious. I feel like that's a common thing people try and do to sort of hack their the algorithm growth, is like copy other things. And I think like Cicria or one of those guys made some like, here's like the fastest way to draw. It's like iterative drawing. Or something, I don't know. And I'm like, well, why aren't you really good now? Hey, like it's twice as good at if you're twice as fast as everyone else, like, why do you still suck at drawing? You know, like 10 years later, because that video is heaps old, you know, and it's just like, it's so obvious, right? The only way to get better is the same thing that everyone who's really good says, which is like, it's really hard. Firstly, if you ask like John Park or any of those, you know, like, you know, all those people we've had, the people from, you know, animation industry, film industry, right? They're all like, oh, it's really hard. I worked really hard. You know, those people, you know, went to Art Center or one of those kind of things and worked like 16 hours a day. And they're just like foundation, foundation, foundation. You got to learn your perspective. You know, there's no quick way. That's what everyone says, right? That's what they say. Like, what's the quickest way? Oh, work really hard and learn your foundation, you know? So that's kind of the trick. There's no other trick. And if there was, all those people would be really good, right? They'd be better than, if you look at some of the best artists, someone, again, like, you know, we often use John Park as a good example because he has done a lot of different things that are interesting, and he's, you know, sort of at the top of the game industry wise. You know, like, why aren't they better than him? If someone's got a better way, why aren't they better? You know what I mean? And that's someone who's like working really hard. And it's just, that's what they'll say. You take a brainstorm thing with him, and I'm pretty sure that's what he's going to say. Foundation, 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 work really hard, you know? It's simple, right? There's no trick. There's no trick around that. And it is kind of boring, right? You're doing a lot of this sort of box stuff and those kind of things. But you got to understand is, yeah, again, this is not like your personal projects, you know, this is not your cool drawing. This is just us learning perspective, right? That's all. It's not like, you know, it's not how you have to work in the future. This is just us learning perspective right now, building foundation. It's the quickest way to get better. You know what I mean? And you should do a bunch of this and then go draw some cool stuff in your sketchbook. You know what I mean? To sort of, you know, decompress. Yeah, because it is dry. That's kind of the point. The problem is, if we make it not dry, it's very easy to, like, the problem with a lot of design exercises, it's very easy to make a design look cool, even if the drawing is not the best, right? That's one of the most dangerous things you can have, is a lot of people are actually quite good at like fudging it, right? And I would say, Simon, that the people who have struggled the most in this class are people who are already kind of okay at drawing cars and stuff.
Yep.
I feel like those people struggle the most, and almost like most of them don't make it because they just don't believe it, right? They're kind of like, I can kind of do it. And every sort of car drawing that they do would just be a little bit wobbly. And I'm like, dude, you're just winging it. It's wobbly, I can see. And it's kind of like, And again, there just is not that belief in the foundational sort of stuff. You know, so it's kind of like, we want to avoid any exercise where you can make this look cool any way other than drawing the perspective well. Does that make sense? That's how that's designed, because otherwise the quickest way to make something look cool and be like, oh, good job me, is to just make it look interesting, right? With an interesting design, or, you know, cool rendering, or cool, you know what I mean? So that's why it's kind of like, we're doing this boring sort of subject. It exists, you know, like an old sort of Ferrari, blah, 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 right? It's because the only way to make it look good is to draw it really well. There's no redeeming features. Anyway, let's take a break.
Okay.
And we'll come back and probably rant more about this stuff, right? If history is any lesson. Cool. We'll see you in 5 or 10.
Okay.
It's doesn't like like you can't bend it to enjoy what it has to be like but everything like I feel like that. I have to think I literally had like this thing I wish like there's it's all come together. Yeah. It's the one in which one? Where artworks, yeah, 2 illustrations. I'm saying a maximum of 5. I'm not up to it yet. I literally it's the same as the composition studies, except now you're taking the values and scroll down and you see an example of the values. So up the last one, something like that. It's not intimidating as you see. What do you think the values? That's the illustration. Alright, actually after this one, let me show you this
Yeah. Yes, supposed to be like as well. Yeah. It's just, well, I had to, last semester, last ride, that was the show I was going for, and like ever since, just like, guess before, graduate festival, like, he said art, and I said, yeah, it's cool. Like, okay. Design, applied, and since accounting from that year, in like, George, like, Waluigi. Yeah, but I think they want me to do Bowser instead, because they want the lights, through, or, like, red, after.
I think like because she did hardcore, wasn't it that
All right, I'm back.
Hey.
Hey. All right, so I'll just quickly go over this so you guys can see what we sort of did in the. But I think you could also put up that, or maybe we could get Brecken to find some of these things and kind of maybe turn them into videos. I don't know how succinct they were.
Yeah, no, we can do that.
But the basic idea is that you would take that sketch, right, which is down here somewhere, right? So we take this little sketch that we've done, and what we do is we try and derive, if I'll just delete all things that aren't layers, because otherwise this is going to be a total nightmare. Yeah, so we take a sketch, and then what your goal is to actually kind of try and find out where some vanishing points from that would be. Now, the thing is, again, as you know, that's not really going to fit a true cube grid or anything, right? Because those vanishing points, don't necessarily relate, in any particular way to each other. But that's kind of okay, because unless we derive measuring points from that, we don't really need to sort of define that, right? Like because we're only sort of drawing one object and we're not using measuring points, you kind of don't need to do that, right? They could be of a true cube. It's just we're not drawing anything else that's a true cube. So that will kind of do for most cases, right? I think in this case, what we can do though is actually, go a little bit further, right? Figure out where that sort of station point would be. And that way, we could derive our measuring points and again, get sort of a true cube from that. But again, there's many different ways you could potentially do that. And I think as we discussed previously, I think in this one, right? Because I think we went over this in sort of pretty good detail, like how you can derive a true cube using the sort of circle method. I think we went over that in this class earlier on. So you can use those sort of methodologies, or as you can see here, right? You could actually just, again, you have, as long as you sort of figure out where right, where your station point is in relation to these. And again, if I kind of put that station point, sort of somewhere below the car, then I can actually put in measuring points, right? And then I could sort of draw this sort of cube here with those measuring points. So there's many ways you can basically take a little sketch and we draw a grid around it, right? And again, this does mean you have a big page here, but that's not the worst problem, right? You can just kind of have a big Photoshop document that you use specifically for this. And you just put a little sketch in there and you try and derive sort of vanishing points from that. And that basically gives you a grid that is kind of in line with your little sketch that you know to be true. Now, again, the degree to which it's true is that, will depend on how true you want it to be. Again, I think it's probably best that we all sort of go with the concept of, figuring out the station point. We could get measuring points here, pretty easily. You can see the way we've sort of done it here is, again, a little bit sort of different, right? But it would totally be possible to do that just by saying, well, I've got a vanishing point here and I've got a vanishing point here. Now, the other sort of tricky thing that's a little bit hard to understand potentially to begin with is that if you have two vanishing points, right? Where the station point is not fixed, right? Until you sort of figure out, again, how you're going to link those two up, right? So we could do something like this, for instance, right? This could be where our station point is, right? And that would still, right? That would still have basically, and I see I've just put that in there roughly, but that would still mean that, again, these lines which are based on our sketch, right? They're all coming from the same vanishing point. But until you set the station point, you don't really know where your center of vision is in 2 point. So again, the trick here is I don't want to try and make this more complicated than it needs to be, but depending on how true you want this to be, you can either just kind of rough in a few, lines, which is similar to what I sort of, did when I was sketching that sort of sci-fi car thing. You could, again, use the circle method to derive what is, roughly a true cube. You could also actually go through and put in station points and put in measuring points. But you do have to understand, if you do that, it is a little bit like, well, where does it go? It kind of goes wherever you want, as long as, again, you're thinking about where you want your center of vision to be in relation to your subject. So all I would say is, obviously, to me, you kind of want your center of vision, right, to be sort of more directly above your object, right? Because that's gonna mean that the true cube you draw here is going to be based a little bit more on, again, us being sort of here, right? Us being sort of, centered. So I think that'll give you a better result. If you're sort of sitting there in the ether going, where does my station point go? It goes wherever you want, but I'd say let's position it sort of, more or less directly under your main subject. Simple. But if I put in that station point, right, and then I've got my sort of center of vision, not to be confused with cone of vision, but I've got my sort of center of vision. The other thing you can sort of understand is that, again, we do actually have that center of vision concept that you would need to think about as you position your, where do we go, about there? Yeah, you do actually have that center of vision and that cone of vision that you need to consider. Now, you don't need to fully, go crazy with any of these things, but if you just sort of understand, the further back your station point is from your center of vision relative to your sort of object, the more likely it is, right, to fit within that cone of vision, right? So if I just sort of illustrate that by putting in that sort of circle, right, you can see we're within that cone of vision, so that's kind of fine. But it would be possible, again, for me to kind of move the station point around, right? And if I sort of, moved it up, you can see that, my subject may start to not be in the cone of vision. So when you're placing a station point, right, relative to a pair of vanishing points, and what we have to do is, again, make sure that, sorry, and this is probably not 100% explicitly clear, but we need the station point to meet to sort of meet at this kind of 90-degree angle from both vanishing points, right? So we should draw a line from the station point to each vanishing point, and those lines should be 90 degrees apart. That's sort of part of our basic true cube grid. So again, you can there's lots of flexibility, right, in how we take a sketch and we create a grid around it. And that's really important to understand. So you kind of do have to think about it, but either way, no matter what we do, as long as we're basing it off these vanishing points, okay, it's going to look roughly like the sketch. But certainly we could derive a true cube there from, doing the measuring point thing, right? Where you measure a measuring point from the right vanishing point to the station point, 5, 4, right? And it's something, right? It's somewhere like that. Right, so there we would have a measuring point. So hopefully this makes sense. Let me know if you guys have got any questions about sort of what I'm talking about, right? Because again, I'm sort of rushing over it, but at the same time, we have covered a lot of this. So I'm assuming most people are sort of on board. But let me know. We have a measuring point there. And then again, we could, try replicate this sort of cube, right? And once you have that sort of cube, everything's sort of, easy after that in terms of everything's kind of like pretty much controllable once you have that sort of general proportion, right? Everything sort of gets pretty simple. Yeah, interesting to sort of see. We can see how accurate our circle sort of prediction is there, right? By kind of running a line there. I don't know how, because this was done last semester, right? Kind of test that, right? See, is this measurement anyway valid? How high is that? That's 233. This one is 249, so not great. Not great. And 237, that one's pretty good. Yeah, so again, either way, this is going to be, it's going to be half decent, right? Which is really all we need. We just need something that's kind of okay. And we need to know that, again, when we use this circle measurement, and probably also when we use this, we never want to base our wheels, right, 100% in there. We want to prioritize the minor axis if we draw any sort of wheels there. But yeah, again, there's lots and lots of ways you can basically, create that full grid, that true cube grid. And then it's just a matter of sort of saying, okay, well, here was my sketch, but let's divide our reference into some sort of proportional system, right? So this is where we sort of do that, we draw some grids over everything, and you kind of say, well, okay, I've got one sort of true cube here. Come on, do a drawing. Right, so I've sort of got one cube here. And my basic job is, again, to sort of draw, one cube. And then to say, well, how many cubes back do I need to draw? Like 1, 2, all right. And again, we sort of end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? In that sort of proportional system that I was using. Yeah, and that's kind of and that's sort of 5 and a bit, right? For the little bit of exhaust out the back. And that's kind of how we sort of do it. So the next goal for me, right, is kind of saying, okay, I need to draw like a box that's 1 cube by 5 cubes. And then I need to sort of add wheels on that. And then the question is like, well, how far out do those wheels come, right? And I think, again, I sort of, we sort of had some rough sort of estimations there. I think one of the reasons my wheels came out a little bit more is because I was probably just basing it off sort of half of the car and stuff like that. But again, you can sort of potentially guesstimate this distance, right? You can guesstimate this distance, you can guesstimate the distance of, the wheel, right? And you could probably do it, sort of with one wheel and kind of say, oh, how far out does that wheel come? Oh, it comes out that far. How far out is the out one? The trick is then we just need to accurately mirror those dimensions over here, right? So again, you can do some guesstimation, right? Because at some point, right, you're having to sort of guess like, okay, this is how high the wheel is, right? Versus this is how high this wheel is versus this wheel. So there is some guesstimation, right? Where you're kind of like making some things bigger than others by hand. The trick is you need to mirror those across, right? So any decision you make in one area, right, you need to sort of mirror it across. And the number one way we sort of control that sort of stuff is via the ground plane, right? So again, we're dealing with mirroring, right? So we're finding the center of our sort of 1 by 5 set of cubes. And then we're sort of figuring out where on the ground plane does that axle, right? Does that axle come out? And then you can sort of measure on the ground plane how far from the side of the car to the side of the wheel is it, right? And then how far does that wheel go out? How far does this wheel at the back come out from the front wheel, right? And you just sort of go through and deal with all of those sort of issues, again, on the ground plane, right? Down there, that's sort of where the trick comes. So a lot of it is understanding, again, we've sort of got our sketch, but much of what we're trying to do is actually derive a simple proportional. Let's see if I can. Rough in something that might be like a true cube. I'm just doing this sort of super rough. And again, but we might have something like that, right? So, okay. All right, I've got my series of boxes. But really what I'm after is what is happening on the ground plane, right? So understanding, and we go over this more when we sort of when we do our sort of plane, because to a certain degree, this helps us with the Ferrari, but you can do this stuff like on the actual ground plane. Like you might imagine, where's the ground plane in relation to my sort of series of boxes? It might be here. But what also is really useful is to think about, well, let's just sort of do our measuring on a plane that's actually well below the car, right? So we can take all of these basic proportions that we've sort of done, and we can actually draw a plan for what our car is going to look like on the ground, but actually, in some ways below the ground. Here we can play around with all of those ideas. We had, and this is again something you've sort of seen me do in the video. Right, so we've got a rough grid. Again, this is just diagrammatic, so please don't, this is not what you're doing. This is just me diagrammatically showing you sort of the sort of things that we would do. And yeah, then we sort of say, well, again, where is that, right? Where is that, let's copy this. That's actually pretty small, right? And then we kind of just say, well, where's this wheel, right? Well, it's kind of like, you know, again, halfway, maybe a little bit, you know, right, a little bit up from halfway, right? Maybe not 100%, so it's like sort of somewhere here, right? Again, we can sort of guesstimate some of these values. And yeah, this is super rough. Get away, you. Let's draw on that. That's what I want. So yeah, let's try to be a little bit more accurate with the top and the bottom. This is where Simon's like, why didn't you just draw it properly? Why are you doing this? And part of it is because, again, it's just like I'm just sort of start by thinking about it in a diagrammatic way. So it's just like sort of showing you roughly what I'm talking about. Right. What you'll find also is just a few like sort of nice true lines will really sort of help true everything else up. We often don't need to go crazy. So again, I've got rough lines there. So again, you know, I've sort of got my 1, 2, 3, etc. So I know that and that axle of that wheel is going to be a little bit in from there, right? Again, it's sort of going to be a little bit here. But the most important thing is that it's in the same position from left to right. Right, so the real key is, again, as we sort of go down here. The real key is that it's just either side of this is the same, right? So we think about, again, here's my sort of axle, right? That's my wheel. Basically drawing, let's drag this over. What I'm doing is basically drawing this guy on the ground. So as I said, right, I can sort of potentially, you know, guesstimate these distances a little bit, right? If I sort of say, well, you know, find that center. Again, super guessing this. Say we got something like that. And so I've got my sort of center line. The real trick is, again, when you're doing this, we are going to guesstimate something. So I can kind of say, well, maybe that's the gap in there, right? And, you know, maybe this is sort of the, you know, this is the width of that front tire. That's okay. It's okay for me to sort of guesstimate that. And then I, you know, sort of say, well, how far does it take up, you know, this way, right? Versus, you know, here. Well, it's basically like hitting back here, but like it's a little bit, right? It's a little bit there. You can guesstimate one, but then we just have to base all of our other measurements off off that one. So I know that, again, this back wheel comes out a little bit sort of further. We know that it lines up pretty much on the inside. We know that the back axle, again, is kind of pretty much smack bang down back of there. So again, we can sort of put in, right, like that sort of axle there. We know that this is gonna, again, roughly over here, right? So again, it's just a matter of sort of going through, and then the real trick is I need to mirror these right across onto the other side. And that's where, again, you know, we talked many times about how, right, you can, you know, the many ways you can sort of mirror distance. Right, it's just a matter of doing all this kind of basic stuff. So these are just things that we're going to be, does that look right? Yeah, something like that. Right, so again, now I've got that line over there. Right, and now we can sort of start to measure out, right, and find these lines. So now I kind of know, again, where that sort of outside of that wheel is going to be, and we just sort of follow along and along and along. So there is some guesstimation, right? But a big part of what you need to do is just figure out, like, where are the extremities of these things. So the real key that I'm trying to find is, again, just this, right, this line, right? I'm trying to find those axle lines, trying to find the outlines of those wheels. And once I have them, again, I can sort of take them up here, right? And we can start to actually sort of build our car, right? Build our car here, and we can take these sort of proportions up and use those, right, roughly. I'm just using those as a rough sort of guide, right? But again, we can take those sort of extremities up there, right? Draw our wheels in there. That's basically the goal, is we sort of want to build that stuff. Yeah, you just want to build these boxes, right? So the main thing we're trying to build is these boxes on the ground, right? Proportionally, where we know where the axles are, we know how big the wheels are roughly, you know, and the wheels, again, you know, this back wheel is a bit bigger, maybe it's coming out a little bit more, whatever, right? You need to pay attention to the reference and try and match that. But I think the trick is to understand that we need to get within, I would say, I don't know what we've said in the past, Simon, but I sort of say you need to get within 10% of the reference. So if, you know, for instance, if you look at mine, right, and a lot of it is which reference do you use, you know, this one seems to have these wheels be more similar, right? The top-down view, okay, has a slightly different car, right? This one has a slightly different car. So, you know, there is a specific sort of version of the car that we're sort of referencing. You know, if you look at, like, you know, exactly which one this is. But yeah, like if you change it, right, like if your mirrors are, like, you know, 2 millimeters out, that's less important than if they are equal, than if they're equal, right? So the same thing, if your wheels are like a tiny little bit bigger, like 5% bigger or 10% bigger, or, you know, something like that, you know, like, again, if your sort of, you know, line down here is a little bit sort of different or whatever, that's not quite so important. But it is important that, like, you know, the car is sort of mirrored accurately from side to side and it feels consistent. Things where people have run into trouble in the past is, you really do have to pay attention to like where the axle is in relation to the engine. So often people have sort of drawn the wheels in first, and then they kind of realize they don't actually have room to fit all of this stuff in there. So you do have to pay attention to the proportion, right, and exactly where that engine ends so that you can draw the axle sort of going behind the engine. Otherwise people are like, my axle kind of goes in here, and it's like, well, it can't. You know, so there's some things that matter and there are some things that don't. And a big part of what you're learning is to tell the difference between what matters and what doesn't, right? So yeah, it could be a slightly different, it could look at like a slightly different Ferrari, but but the back wheels must be the same left to right. Okay, so we can't have like, one wheel kind of over here, right? And be like, oh, that perspective's off, but that matters a lot. Right, but if again, if these side mirrors are like a little bit out that way, right? As long as this one also is out that way, that's okay, right? If they're a slightly different shape, that's okay, but they must both be exactly the same shape.
Yeah, and so you just use with the wheels and stuff, like use the orthographic to help you. That's what I would do. I would just kind of look at the orthographic and get it to kind of help you with those placements and where that all kind of goes. Yeah, and just also be aware that there are all these like the reference. So because we've had lots of students with this problem, so this car and the references are all slightly different because this was done before time of like these were like kind of mass produced. Like this is literally like a kit bashed together car. So the orthographic that Tim has there and the orthographic that I'm looking at are slightly different. Right, so you just got to pick one and sort of roll with it, and then try and get it accurate to that sort of one. But just be aware. Just be aware. It's like they haven't made a mistake in the orthographics or anything. They're different. Does that make sense to everyone? Yep. Because in other people are like, yeah, but there's one that's this and that. It's like the cars are different cars. Like when you see it's got number 2 and number 8 and number 17, it's like it's a different freaking car. So and they're kind of hand built these cars. They're not all the same. So if like some have a different shaped air intake and stuff like that. So it's cool. You can do whichever. Just make sure you like stick with it. So don't go off the orthographic for one and like the reference of another where they're like different. Does that make sense? Yeah. Don't mix it, match them. Try and just pick one and then go with that.
Yeah, I think it is the one that I've sort of drawn is this one, right? So it's a Ferrari 312, and I think it's a particular type, right?
It's the 1967 Chris Amon.
It is a 1967, but it's from a particular race because they basically would rebuild it, right?
Like, so if the guy smashes it, they like replace it, but not with like the same thing. It's just sort of like, it's kind of the same, or they like made some engineering improvements and then it's like slightly different.
Yeah, so you can kind of see again, it's the 1967 Chris Amon Ferrari 312, and I think there's like minor differences based on which race it ran in that year. But there are some, I think, as Sam was saying, that are quite different from maybe the next year, and there are some that have like a spoiler, like a rear wing, and on some of them, this kind of intake here is a little bit sort of different. Again, if you end up mixing and matching it, we don't really care as long as it's consistent side to side and you just do understand that's kind of happening, right? But yeah, that's I think this is basically the one that I feel like I don't know, even that I think that's a bit different. That's the one I drew because you see it's got the engine, like throttle body intake things on the side there. You can see like some of them, I think that's the same. It's just got sort of mesh on there, right? But yeah, they're sort of slightly different, right? So you just have to pay attention to those things, right? Like, don't freak out about it, but You know, I think again some of the photos from here though, like I think these are taken present day. They're not taken in the 70s, as you can see just by the general camera quality. Not that it's better, just because it looks like a modern camera. And you can see again, I think this probably has different wheels on it than it did back in the day. So yeah, look, we don't care as long as you draw a Ferrari that, you know, is from this sort of roughly this era. But you can see here, this kind of scoops up on some of them. They sort of don't. Anyway, don't fret about that. At some point, it becomes your Ferrari. You choose which details to put on. But yeah, just be aware that, you know, if you can swap reference and then be like, wait, what happened? Yeah, the main things are just make sure it's drawn solidly, right? And that it's the same side to side. That's the main thing. Yeah, you don't need to put any of the decals on it if you don't want, right? Like that again, that's not the whole point of it. But you know, like you can look at the rims and draw the rims. You know, that is its own sort of particular challenge. You know, you can, people have tried to put on the tire tread. Again, I didn't in the original demo. I have done subsequent demos where we sort of talk about how you can render that sort of stuff. But yeah, again, the main thing that everyone needs to do is just understand how to draw curves in perspective, how to draw ellipses and circles in perspective. So by curves, I mean, you know, drawing these curved forms, right? By ellipses, we mean doing the wheels. You need to understand how to mirror and measure, right? Because again, you need to make sure that, you know, the wheels on the rear side are different to the wheels on the sort of, you know, the front side to you. And you need to measure in proportion. So you need to understand how to be like, well, you know, how long is this thing versus how wide is this thing? That's what we call measuring in perspective. Mirroring is where, again, you can make something look as if it's in the same position, side to side. And, you know, the other thing is we need to render some basic different materials, right? You know, some metal, some sort of, you know, glossy paint, some rubber. Got the metal of the engine. We got this sort of white powder coated exhaust. So that's basically the idea. It's a materials exercise, perspective exercise, but, you know, that's really what we care about. You know, we don't care about whether it has the decals on it or whether it's, you know, super shiny or whether it looks really good. You know what I mean? Because again, it's unlikely you're ever going to put this in your folio. You know, you might show it to someone. If someone's like, oh, can you do perspective or whatever? You can show them this and say, oh, I did this as an exercise. But apart from that, you know, that's not really what it's about. Yeah. Anyway, does anyone have any other questions? It's probably what we could do. I feel like I've sort of gone over that sort of enough, because basically all you guys need to do is do 5 sketches of your Ferrari and one that you're going to pick. And then next week we'll cover a little bit more in depth this idea of the demo of how you, where is it? Yeah, like how you again translate that sketch and sort of, you know, move it to the next level. Mostly it's just a matter of, again, controlling the proportion with some boxes, figuring out on the ground plane, again, where your sort of wheels and axles are, again, blocking out the basic sort of forms. And then again, we sort of start moving forward from there. But yeah, maybe we should have a break and we'll come back and do a bit of feedback on some of the material rendering things, see if anyone's got sort of questions about that. But let us know if you've got questions about, you know, the Ferrari itself or the exercise, or not sure what to do. Yeah, but other than that, we'll do some critique from last week's stuff, I reckon.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, so you might see me like shuffling things around because I'm just going to get rid of some of these things and I'll open up some stuff to critique, but don't freak out. When I'm talking, I'll turn on the mic. All right, let's get into it. So I think Aaron here was saying that, again, you're just struggling a little bit finding the brushes in sort of Clip Studio. Yeah, I think that can be challenging because, again, we're using sort of different sort of systems. But again, keep in mind some of the things we talked about last week. A lot of this is just merely about understanding how to use the brushes you do have. So, getting, like selections, getting smooth gradients. Really you only need, if you are thinking about texture, you just need one brush and you need to know how to use it. It's just a matter of what opacity is it? How do you, what sort of shapes and patterns are you using to apply it to add texture? Or just, do you have a big airbrush that you can use? So just remember to keep it simple, Aaron. Again, I think these are sort of looking pretty cool, but yeah, don't feel like we need to, the Photoshop stuff is like that sort of complicated. Certainly I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. Cool. So this is Lewis Kirk. And yeah, I think there's some cool stuff here. I feel like we could still have a little bit of focus on those sort of basic sort of things here. Again, I feel like the texture is good, but the form isn't quite there on some of these. And again, we have sort of unfounded gradients across planes and things like that. So yeah, make sure the basics are there. There's just a little bit of sort of, again, stuff not feeling like that underlying form is fully there yet. Cool. Nice. I think some of that stuff's looking good. Again, a bit more core shadow, same sort of stuff as we would sort of normally say. I think the shininess and those things are looking good, but let's work on this map one a little bit better. I feel like this one is sort of looking good, but again, we could have more overall ambient occlusion in there. Again, we'll see if we get a chance to do some sort of paint over stuff for these. Cool, Ellie. I think the rubber here is looking pretty good. Yeah, nice sort of sense of shininess. Again, I don't think we're going to have quite that sort of halo rim light on the left there. And yeah, a little bit of an unfounded gradient across the plane on the top. So yeah, there's a few things there that I feel like could be, could be done a little bit better. But overall, I think this is looking good. Yeah, these are nice and shiny. And yeah, I feel like the steel, I feel like that it's a little bit too much of that Fresnel effect, right? Is probably what I'm sort of thinking. The cube looks good. This one looks okay. I feel like it's maybe just a bit hot on that sort of highlight, right? Again, that sort of makes it feel like there is like a really sort of strong light, that's kind of like hitting that. And we don't see that from sort of the environment, right? So might just need to be a little bit sort of softer on that. Cool. Nice. So these are from Asia Ray. Cool. I mean, I think there's some good looking stuff there. Again, nice attention to detail there with that rubber. I can see there's a little bit of texture and stuff. I think that's looking pretty cool. Again, could do with like a little bit more highlight on here if you really wanted to push that sort of rubberness. But yeah, I think these are overall looking pretty good. Cool. All right. So here we've got some sort of like some serious texture going on. Again, I feel like that's sort of, it's almost there with some of these. I think that's kind of like almost working. It's just that if you have such, the question is like, what is it? Like, what is is it surface, right? Like, is it just corrosion, or what's happening? Because if we sort of look at this one over here, if there are dents in it, right, then those dents would be rendered as form, right? It's not sort of texture. So the question is like, is it surface texture? If so, why? So it could be corrosion, or something sort of stuck on it, or whatever. But I feel like some of these are like just a little bit, there's a little bit cavalier in the way we're applying these. Because yeah, and also like if it is beaten up that much in some places, then I feel like the rest of it would be a little bit rough as well. So I feel like, again, we just have to think about what is the actual material, see if you can get some reference, maybe show some reference for like what you were trying to get. A little bit of an unfounded gradient across the plane there. This guy's looking sort of pretty cool. I like some of the, if you've got going with the sort of weathering on the edge, but yeah, I feel like some of these big marks are kind of like, well, what is it, right? Because if it is a big chunk or something, you know, it's still in shadow, right? So it's still going to be sort of dark if it's sort of lighter. I'm just not exactly sure what's going on there, right? But I think it's looking pretty cool. Again, we need a bit more sort of ambient occlusion and stuff like that sort of happening. Yeah, so cool ideas. Again, I think a lot of that's sort of working nicely. The rubber is looking good. A bit more ambient occlusion here on the ground plane. This one's looking nice. But yeah, just texture's a little bit too much, I think. Cool. All right. Cool. All right. I think these are looking nice and shiny, right? I feel like that's sort of working well. Again, some good material definition. Might be a little bit too much sort of shininess on some of these, but I think overall you're doing a good job of creating consistent sort of material separation and differentiation. I know that Manon has kind of put like the sort of the ceiling reflection here. Again, yeah, look at the reference that this is based on. Again, just because I think Manon maybe didn't find that reference, the reference. But yeah, it's interesting in the 3D reference that we're sort of looking at. The ceiling is kind of dark, and this one doesn't show any of that reflection, which is sort of interesting. It's similar to that, right? So the top, unless it's sort of spherical, it's not picking that up. But yeah, you can sort of see how that sort of functions. So I think, again, we see the stretch sort of on the side, but on the top, it seems like, yeah, it just reflects the black, which is sort of interesting. So we probably won't see that sort of halo, won't see that sort of reflection on the top as much. But again, I'm not so concerned about that. Again, we give you guys the reference to kind of be like, well, this is kind of like a weird 3D thing that doesn't exist. This is how it thinks it looks. Your job is to kind of just try and get it looking metallic, right? And I think these do look metallic, right? I do think that that's sort of working, which is awesome. The rubber, I feel like that's working pretty well. We might have a tiny little bit more shininess, might sort of help to sell that. But I think overall, you're definitely getting the idea, Alana. I think it's all sort of working nicely. And the main thing that's really important here is you can refine things a little bit more, maybe, but there's a definite separation, right? These are definitely different materials, completely sort of different, very sort of, yeah, very differentiated, which is awesome. I think that's the same one for some reason. Cool. These are Amara's. Nice. So again, similar thing that I was saying before about the texture. It might just be, again, if we're sort of roughing it up that much, I'm going to start to expect to see sort of maybe, you know, the edges of the cube are not quite as clean. And again, same thing here. There's just a little bit of sort of, it feels a little bit sort of dirty. And these sort of halos on the side just feel like they're a little bit too much, right? Yeah, I think that's mostly okay. But again, remember the Fresnel effect is going to be all the way around. Okay, so you've got that kind of halo Fresnel effect, but remember it's going to be everywhere. Okay, it's not going to be on the cube over here because the cube doesn't function with the Fresnel effect in the same way. It's just sort of flat planes. Yeah, and I feel like the top there is just a little bit brushy, right? But lots and lots of good stuff happening. Could have a little bit more ambient occlusion on those sort of spheroid objects, right? I feel like that one's a little bit better. Again, that one was sort of missing it on the object. So yeah, I think there's some good stuff sort of happening. But yeah, we just need to think a little bit more about what is actually happening, right? Because I think you're a little bit in fantasy land with it, where you're kind of like, oh, I can make this look interesting. This is kind of working, but let's just try and stick to the realism of it a little bit more. And again, remember here, we've got the top is kind of reflecting the darkness of the sky, right? In that metallic one.
Yeah, I think just for anyone who's like just not sure of the Fresnel effect, like just remember, think your way through it. So the Fresnel effect is happening on the sphere because basically the sphere is seeing that like everything's wrapping around three-dimensionally from front to back, right? It's circular. So on the sides of that sphere, it's seeing what's on, I'm using lots of hand gestures, Tim. It's not very good online.
Yeah.
It's seeing the sides of the world, right? So it's actually seeing, like, that's what you're painting. It's just the strip of light that the sphere's actually seeing on the sides, like off to the left and right. With a cube, all right, that plane is not facing that way, all right? I've known Tim's, you haven't mentioned this for a while, but like one good thing to think about what each face is doing is put your eyeballs on that face and look out. So what's that face looking at? So in no way...
Imagine you are that face.
Yeah.
What do you see?
Yep. So in no way is the face of the cube like seeing the other corners of the room. Does that make sense? So you're not going to get the Fresnel effect on the cube because it's not doing that. It's only on the spheroid objects. So the egg and the sphere, that's what's happening. It's just because they're seeing like those, as it wraps around, the sides of the sphere is seeing left and right of the room. So it's going to reflect whatever's there. So imagine there's some like yellow, like sky or something off on that side, right? That will be kind of like that Fresnel effect because it's like it's seeing over there. Does that make sense to everyone? Like that's what it is. So on the cube, it doesn't exist because it's not functioning the same way. It's not wrapping around. Yeah?
So if there was Fresnel effect like that much on here, it would kind of be everywhere, if that makes sense, because it's sort of doing it. The cube, it doesn't matter that this is facing the light. All that matters is that as this surface turns away from us, right here, it's less reflective. But as it gets further and further away from our direct line of sight, right over here, right at the edge, basically we're kind of almost looking past it, right? So what that means is this little bit here that is a few pixels to us actually represents like, you know, maybe this much space.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see we're
like
sort of seeing on the side of that, right? Yeah, so if you imagine there was sort of, you know, we sort of drew circles on it, right? Okay, you know, you kind of have circles, but, you know, a circle over here is going to be, it's a golf ball or something, remember? Imagine that. So like a golf ball sort of, you know, has circles on it or something. I think if I remember, I don't play golf really. But the one that's like just over there is on the edge is right. It's almost like we're barely going to see it, right? And so what that means is we've sort of got a lot of surface area, right, that we're seeing very, you know, close. And what's happening if we look at it from the side is, again, our eye is sort of looking at it here. Right. So our eye is kind of looking at this, and when we sort of hit here, right, we sort of hit around here, what happens? Well, the light sort of bounces back, right, and you get this direct read on what sort of the surface is, right? As we sort of hit more and more sort of not directly onto the surface, you get different light effects happen, right? So the more sort of we are like, the more the surface is at an angle, right? So what you can imagine is, again, essentially at the micro level, right down, if you like zoom into the point of a photon, which is sort of what a light is, right? It's these tiny little, you know, light particles or wavelengths or whatever. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, guys. But essentially at some point, right, this is a plane, like when you hit straight on, right, it's hitting straight on, right? When it kind of comes over here and hits here, it's almost like it's hitting a plane that's like that, right? So it goes bonk, right? And when it's sort of just over here, right, it's kind of almost passing through it, right? It's almost like not even hitting the object. These light rays kind of really sort of bounce off, right? It's almost like it's kind of a surface like that, and the light rays kind of bouncing off like that, if that makes sense. Because it kind of bounces off at a similar angle. It comes in, I think. Again, not a scientist, not even a bro scientist. I really don't know. But that's the basic idea. And so again, we sort of talked about that idea where, you know, you're looking at the lake, right? And you sort of got mountains in the background, right? And you've got sort of, you know, a lake, right? Off in the distance, right? You often see, again, the perfect reflection of the lake, right? As it gets sort of close to the horizon, you know, you can see all the clouds sort of reflected. As you sort of look down, right? If you sort of look down at your feet, you'll almost be able to see straight through the water to the rocks underneath, right? If there's a fish there, you'll be able to see the fish running around. If there's a fish over here, you can't see it. Okay, fish here you can see, right? Draw a proper, right? So if there's a fish here, you can see it. If there's a fish here, for a big fish, you can't see it. Why? Because the surface of the water becomes more reflective, right? The further away from us it is. It's not that it's further away, right? It's that if you think about, and again, we'll take this to the nth degree. If you're standing here, right, and you look down, what's happening, right? You can see that the angle of the light is direct, right? I'm looking down, right? And that light, right, it's bouncing up, right? So I'm going to see, you're going to see through the water, right? As I look down, right, to maybe, you know, sort of something around here, again, I'm getting this more sort of softer angle. If we take it all away, though, and I'm looking over here, what happens is that, right, I have this really soft angle. And what that means is, right, the way we describe it is here, right, our line of sight or our eye sort of gaze is sort of hitting the object directly, right? It's hitting that sort of ground plane directly, right? And it's almost sort of, again, perpendicular to the surface, right? So perpendicular is sort of at right angles. Whereas when we're doing it here, what you can see is that this is almost parallel to the surface, right? So if I'm looking over here, right, my line of sight is almost parallel to the surface that I'm looking at, right? So that would be, so if I have a surface, right, line of sight here would be, it's spelled perpendicular, so I don't completely butcher it. Yeah, that's tricky. Oh, not purple. It's like perpendicular, right? And this one is right think that's how you spell parallel. So again, that's basically the idea. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm trying to explain it in a whole bunch of different ways. But the point is that as your line of sight becomes more parallel with the surface, it becomes more reflected. The best way you can look at this is, if you guys are in class, right, you've got a white IKEA desk in front of you, and you have a giant projector screen in front of you. Now, as you look down at your white IKEA desk, okay, it is not reflecting the environment that much. But if you lower your eye level, right, you can do the same thing with, any sort of, somewhat sort of shiny object. You could do it with a phone, or, like a MacBook is like a good thing, right? You look directly in a MacBook, it's not a mirror. But if you lower your, right, so if you think about, again, I'm sort of drawing it, you got a desk, right? If you're sort of up here and you're kind of looking down at your desk, right, it is not reflective. If you actually like get down on your knees and look directly at that desk, right, what you start to see is it becomes more and more reflective, right? Where you might see, depending on how reflective it starts off as, but you will see some colors reflected in your desk if you get right down to the point where like almost you kind of can't see it. Almost your eye level is, your horizon line is directly at the surface, right? It will start to reflect the environment, right? To the point where, like, if you take a MacBook or something, which, MacBook Pro, like, that's kind of a bit glossy. If you bring that up right to your eyes, it'll be almost a complete mirror, right? If I take a MacBook Pro, one of those silver ones, and I take it right up to my eye, I can read the text on the screen, right, through the mirror in the MacBook, right? So the Fresnel effect is quite, quite significant, and it basically turns any surface into a mirror if you are, sort of close enough to it. And so what that means is, again, the spheroid objects, as they wrap around, at some point, right here, we're looking directly up the object, but over here, again, it's almost like that table. It's almost like that sort of river, sea, lake environment, right? Where like over here, again, we can see the fish, right? You can see the actual object. Whereas as that wraps away, right, the line of sight becomes more parallel with the surface, right? It's more like this. And then this bit of the sphere, this bit of the spheroid all the way around, because it's completely the same, becomes highly reflective relative to this. Okay, so it's all relative, right? It'll get way more reflected. And that's why at the periphery of a sphere, right, or a spheroid object, you see a halo of reflection of the environment. Now, what this means is, again, it is literally the chrome mirror. It's reflecting the top. So here, it's more likely that it's going to reflect the gray of the background here. Here, it's more likely that it's going to reflect the gray on the ground, right? So again, the way I sort of often do it is I'm sort of cheating a little bit. Again, I'm doing that iconography of the Fresnel effect, where often I'll actually balance a bit of like both. And the point is, it kind of just has sort of like a general environmental sort of glow around it. Again, very, very subtle. But it means that, yeah, we're probably not likely, it won't be a very sort of highly reflective thing like this, right? It won't be sort of super sort of shiny or like a little highlight. It'll just be sort of very, very, very simple, right? So yeah, hopefully that makes sense, right? That's sort of what's happening there. Again, you can kind of explain it as much as you want. The best way to learn how those things function is to go look at them, right? That always sort of gives you the best sort of thing. But if we look at some of these, you can see those concepts working, and we did look at those sort of previously. I think there's a couple here that work quite well. But here you can see a good example of that. Okay, so you can see as we sort of get sort of close, right, to the periphery, this is actually starting to be quite reflective. And this is a shiny reflective object, but it is really reflecting quite clearly, right, when it's sort of close here. And again, we're sort of at that sort of hyper reflective sort of angle. Right, so you can see again, this is sort of super matte, right? It's it's a very sort of matte sort of object, right? And again, you can barely see any reflection, right? It is reflecting the green, okay? And it's sort of hard to see sort of, a lot of stuff. But if you kind of look over here, right, we're starting to see here a little bit of what looks like a reflection of an environment, right? Because this form is starting to turn away from us. The same thing is happening on the top, right? I mean, if this is really matte, then why is it reflecting the sky, Well, it's reflecting the sky mostly, where, again, those surfaces are kind of, turning away from us. And you can see just at the top, you're starting to see some heavy reflection, right? Just as that fully turns away from us, right?
And
just the same as here.
Yeah, and like
seems more reflective.
If you sort of summon your inner, John Liberto, right? You can if you do some of this in your paintings, it will like make it look cool. It'll make it feel, even if it's like kind of cartoony, it'll make it feel more kind of realistic, So it's really cool to understand this, because then you can kind of like shorthand it, even though if you haven't worked it out exactly, just like all those forms that are kind of like all the planes that are kind of facing towards the sky or going away from my eye, you can just, add a bit of reflection in them, right? And then it'll make stuff look cooler. So that's how you can use it in real life.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it doesn't have to be, here's another sort of good example. Again, as it sort of, this is reflective, but it becomes more reflective at the periphery, right? So again, it's not reflecting everything here. It's not like chrome. If chrome was here, it would be reflecting us. You know what I mean? Whatever this light is, we'd be able to see that. Where it's most reflective, though, again, is at the periphery, and that's the Fresnel effect, right? Again, you're not going to see it as much on something that's sort of hyper matte, with like a lot of sort of light on there. But this is why you get these halos, right? It's why you get these halos around the edge. You can see that just generally it's lighter there and it's really clear here, right? And you're getting that sort of haloing. That's why that happens. And it's one of the primary things that will tell you, what stuff, what makes stuff realistic, right? But again, you can kind of see here, right? Again, we can sort of see through this thing, but at the periphery here, it's starting to be more reflective, right? You don't notice these things. We don't notice them because our brain is tuned to get rid of them, right? You see the form. Otherwise, it's just complete nonsense, right? There's just so much junk information here. This one, I think, is one of the ones where you can see it the best. And I think we did look at this a couple of weeks ago. But you can see, again, once we're over here, right, we got the same sort of object here, and we sort of can't really see much of what's happening. And you might think, oh, that's because it's sort of dark, and it's not because it's dark, right? If this was chrome, we'd have a full reflection of this entire hedge, right, in this entire bonnet, right? We'd get full reflection sort of everywhere. But we sort of don't, we don't get that. We get more over here because, again, this is more sort of parallel to our line of sight than this, right? And again, there's the person here standing here taking a photo, right? But it's not showing that. But as we go over here, right, again, this is starting to become more parallel with our line of sight. Again, we're almost just sort of, seeing only just the very edge of this all the way back here. And again, you can see this is almost acting like chrome back here. We're getting full reflection of everything. And as at the top, you can see the top is really picking up a lot of that green, right? Just as it sort of really turns away from us, the top of this car gets green, which is, again, sort of weird, right? So again, you can sort of see how those things are sort of functioning, how that sort of works, how it doesn't work. But yeah, if you understand these concepts, it makes sense of this stuff, right? It makes sense of what's going on, right? So again, it's a black car, but over here you can see almost like, a very sort of perfect, clean reflection of this stuff, right? Okay, so this is black, completely sort of black here as it sort of turns away, yeah, we're getting hyper reflections on this side. See that over there, right? This is a black car. It's reflecting, but over here it's chrome, right? Green, right? It's reflecting this stuff, right? You can see it's almost like chrome over here. This is a super shiny car, right? So you can see this is the glass, and the glass is probably even smoother. And so this is probably what it would be reflecting, right? If it sort of, was chrome everywhere. But it's depending on what's sort of happening, right? Here, we're seeing just that sort of, typical gloss sort of look, where we're seeing a dampened, darkened down version of the reflection. As it turns away from us, it's basically becoming fully a mirror. But all you see is, oh, it's a cool, shiny black car. Do you know what I mean? You don't notice there's green on it, right? Or that it's hyper reflecting stuff. Most people are just going to be like, oh, look at those rims. Look at that thing. So again, just start to notice these things when you're looking around, because this is exactly the sort of nonsense that people are adding when they are, John Liberto or a Craig Mullins or something like that. This is exactly what they're doing to make things look real, right? Yeah, that's we can go on and on, but yeah, just go out in the world and start looking at this stuff, right? This is the iconography of realism. Fresnel effect, ambient occlusion, that's number one, number two things that will make your stuff look real, if that's what you're after. If you're after that look. Anyway, I think we're out of time. I ranted for way too long about the Fresnel effect. But hopefully, the only other thing I just wanted to add about this, because I saw a couple of people doing this, is really think about, like, is this surface texture? i.e., is it a pattern that is sort of printed on here somehow? It could be corrosion, right? So corrosion will sort of eat up without changing the form too much. But, if it is a dent, right, which it kind of feels like it is, then you're going to need to kind of like really be like, okay, the form changes here and then it goes down here, right? If it's a dent, you're going to see it at the edge, right? We're going to see these things, and it's not just going to be flat like that, right? You're going to have to calculate all of the reflections and things as it sort of changes form. So think about, is it a pattern, right? Is it like, this is a ball with a pattern printed on it, or is this actually sort of dented? Is that why it's sort of scratched? Because, a scratch is a dent, right? That's what's happening. It's a gouging of the, material at a very, very low level. If we're getting these, the question is like, what is it? I think it looks cool. Do you know what I mean? I think most people would be like, oh, it looks like sort of rough metal. The problem is, like, is it affecting the silhouette, right? Yeah, and also, that might be a lot harder to deal with when you come to color. And I feel like this one again here, like, the question is like, what is that? Is it like paint on the surface? You know what I mean? Yeah, just those sort of things. So just think about that, right? I feel like it's just a little bit heavy-handed. Yeah, but apart from that, I feel like I went over a couple of tips before that you guys can sort of look at. Again, I feel like here that we got the right idea. It's just a little bit too much Fresnel effect. And again, if this is here, it's going to be here and here as well, right? It doesn't care about whether it's facing the light. Fresnel effect just sort of happens everywhere that, again, our eye becomes parallel with the surface. But yeah, anyway, we can go over these things if anyone's got questions next week. You know what I mean? We can still sort of deal with these things, and we'll be dealing with them when we render the car. So yeah, definitely try and correct those bits and pieces if you can.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah,
I think there's lots of really good improvement overall. I think even on George's there, where you painting the texture on, and yes, maybe it could be like a little bit better. The cool thing is, George, is still reading as a sphere and the egg shape. So it's like it's close. It's really close. It's almost there, and you've done the chrome, and it's lots of good improvement. So yeah, it's awesome. I can just from all the homework that's coming through, you can just see everyone really improving and grasping those things, and that's all you want to do is just improve a little bit each day. Just keep understanding this, getting better at it, not betterer,
Yep.
and then focus on your Ferraris and your sketches this week, and we'll see you guys next week. Okay.
Cool. Sounds good. Yeah. No, there's definitely improvement. Simon knows that stuff better than me. I'm just kind of like nitpicking, and I probably, I'm not looking up to see how people have improved, but I think we are getting away from, stuff really looking flat. You know what I mean? I'm not seeing that anymore. We're starting to move on to these other sort of issues, right? Which is actually really good, right? So cool. We'll see you guys next week, and good luck with your 5 rough Ferrari sketches. I'm keen to see what everyone comes up with, and we'll do some critiques of that next week.
Okay. See you, everyone.